and welcome to the Space for Kentucky Roundtable. The Space for Kentucky Roundtable is a series of meetings focused on growing the space industry. It is about networking, education, and social support for those who are reaching for the stars. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Space for Kentucky. This one is going to be really fun. It is about food in space. You know, the thing is that historically, we have a connection to food in space that it runs very deep. During the Apollo program, there was a lot of new innovations that happened that help us with the method of keeping food safe in space. And we have freeze drying that we use in everything from camping food to formula for babies. And that is something we use all the time in our lives. And also, too, one of the more recent ones is that there is a gas that plants emit that now we have food handling that eliminates a lot of that gas that we discovered up in the International Space Station. And that's why your vegetables don't go bad as quickly in the refrigerator anymore, and they stay on the shelves a lot longer with a lot more shelf life. We have several people that are going to be talking tonight. And one of the exciting things that happened last week was that NASA announced the final phase 3 winners for the Deep Space Food Challenge, which has awards up to $1.5 million during an award ceremony. And 2 of the speakers that we have here today were part of that challenge in some way. And 2 of the other speakers are authors that talk about the culture of food in space. Food for space exploration is from chocolate to cocktails is what we're going to do tonight. And I would like to put a real quick note that one of our speakers was supposed to be Phnam Bagley. She is a phenomenal person, and she is in an event right now related to the Deep Space Food Challenge. Her company is using algae as a food source. We have a space marketing podcast interview from her with her company NonFiction that talks about how we're going to use that from space, because we can't have cows on the way to Mars. It just is not going to work. So we got to come up with other ways to keep people fed, nourished, and it is more than just for that, for our bodies. It's also for our well-being. You know, food is how we break bread. Food is how we celebrate. Food is our culture. So we're going to also talk about the importance of that and how we're going to do that. So let me begin with Stephanie Wan. She is the co-founder of Heritage Space Food, and she is also advisor to the Methuselah, I'm sorry, I should have checked that pronunciation.
Methuselah Foundation.
Thank you. And she has helped administer the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge. So Stephanie, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, Izzy. And I mean, what a fun way to spend Thursday evening talking about 2 of my favorite things, space and food. And I basically began on this journey of space food by helping out with the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge through the Methuselah Foundation, as you've mentioned. And it started about over 3 years ago when there was an idea to combine what are the top NASA priorities after all the other areas of centennial challenges. And of course, food is still one of the main issues to be solved in long-term sustainability of space. And right now, if we take a trip to Mars, that's going to be one of the major issues. There's not many foods that would actually last long enough for a trip to Mars. And especially with the way we plan for trips to go to space, it's a lot of planning. It's a lot of preparing. It's a lot of packing and a lot of sending things out in advance. And so, that journey itself, if we're sending out packages for food in space, it's not going to be good food. But then, secondly, we also didn't really have something like a closed loop food system, and we sort of need that because if you're thinking about a road trip from, I'm in Jersey right now, so Jersey to all the way to California, it's quite a long journey. You probably need a lot of fuel, but also you're not going to carry all that food with you. And that's pretty much our only plan available. So with the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge, it is creating a closed loop food system that really can allow for people, astronauts, to one day grow the necessary nutritious foods on their way to on their space exploration journey. And so the first phase was to do a paper concept, and it actually had over 100 submissions. And when it comes to the just generally the NASA Centennial challenges, it actually over exceeded by far all the other different types of challenges out there in the over the past decade that they've been running challenges, which is, really goes to show how food is so intertwined and really gets everyone excited. That's not just your everyday scientist or engineer. And after that, phase two, which happened last year, they had to then down select and be like, hey, you got to build a prototype now, which was pretty exciting when everyone started 3D printing everything, and tying tubes together and putting up a software and on all the electronic gadgets. And finally, what happened over the summer was the even more down selected group of these challengers. They actually had to feed people and actually make the systems work. So at Ohio State University, they hired four students, what they called simunauts, to over an 8-week period to go and test out these systems to try and grow food on their own with only 30 minutes at a time to talk to the different teams that were available. And so I thought that was quite brave for people to go in and I think, well, they were four complete strangers, students that were hired by NASA, completely different backgrounds from like marketing degrees and like barely scientists to try and I think grow regular, like I think vegetables to insects to and mushrooms for these different systems. And I think and even one was like a baking machine. So they had to really learn how to play around with these things and provide expert results. And so that's what you were talking about, Izzy, last week. They finally selected as the final winner was Interstellar Labs, and then for the U.S. team, and then for the international team, a company called Solar Foods. And but at the end of the day, these are all just ingredients. So what's really pivotal about this now is these teams aren't just winners, but they have to all be collaborators into a larger system of what different nutrients are available out there and how to combine these things into something larger. For example, I know one university that wasn't competing, they're trying to grow duckweed for space. And duckweed is like pond scum, but you're not going to just eat a spoonful of pond scum and call it a meal. You'll need to create something out of it. And and so for what we're doing with the heritage space food is actually having those types of conversations and across all the different cultures and communities, especially as more and more astronauts, space is getting more democratized, and there are more astronauts from different countries that are getting being able to go and fly to the space station for now. They probably want food from their own country. And even there are so many countries that have signed on to the Artemis Accords that they also need to feel included in this journey. And what's the best way to really be part of a journey? It's usually through food. That usually speaks for itself. So there's still so much work to be done, and so happy to be part of this conversation.
And that was one of the things that there's so many challenges, and cooking is one of those challenges. That the freeze drying, one of the requirements back in the Apollo program was that it had to be something that could be reconstituted and become palatable with 80-degree water, which is not boiling. And so cooking in space is a lot more of a challenge. And, having something that you don't have to choke down, because that's a long trip to have something that is nasty to eat. And like you said, with the culture part aspect of it, there is a very big difference between our countries in our food, and that's an important thing. You know, if you take Indian food or Thai food, very different flavor profiles, and how are you going to do that in space? So please, if somebody has a question, go ahead and Sam.
Yeah, I have a question, Stephanie. I'm glad you guys realize that you have to go beyond just freeze-dried food and definitely look at more, foods of all the cultures of the world. What makes humans human? Every culture has their own set of food that they like. But the biggest issue, of course, is that your taste buds change. In
Absolutely.
microgravity, your tongue swells up, your nose swells up, the taste buds aren't
You
working.
might as well just have COVID in space.
And you can't rely on sriracha and hot sauce for everything, you know? So
No.
there must be a system where we can test the foods for Earth and find ways to adapt it to the environment where your taste buds are not working as well. How can we get that flavor to work, maybe pump it up to the nth degree so that, even with someone who's like got a really clogged nose, they can still sense that there's a flavor there?
Yeah, and I mean, my quirky response is like, maybe we should add some MSG, but that's not going to answer those issues. We're actually, so one of the co-founders is a chef, Dahlia David. She's a wellness chef, and part of the journey is to include other chefs on this conversation piece to ensure that it is all about the different parts of your taste buds. That's not just tasting it, but it's like textures and getting the cue. And so I think that is going to be a major issue that we will need to explore further. But if we have chefs part of that conversation, I'm sure they can really make a difference.
And second question, are you collaborating with NASA's Space Kitchen in Houston to find out what they're doing, how they've developed techniques for creating better foods?
So we won one of the NASA Space Tech Catalyst Prize back in April, and that has opened up a lot of doors within NASA for us to engage further within NASA as well as all the other partners that they have. So I would say yes and no, but I think it it provides a lot more opportunity to expand our conversation piece because they're looking at the immediate now, like what to feed the astronauts now versus what we want to create in the future.
Thank you.
Yep. Hey, Shahreen.
Hey, I just wanted to add something. I'll be speaking about it in greater depth when I present our company, but just needed to reiterate the importance of cooking in space. In fact, in my company, Astreas, on our board of directors, we have Vicky Cloris, who was the former head of NASA Food Lab for many, many years. And the amusing part is a food request that Vicky had was actually Indian food. And this made me chuckle because, as you explained, when the olfactory sensation is hampered and you can't smell anything, you have something called trigeminal stimulation. And that's why sriracha, wasabi, these flavors open up the ability to smell. And in space, you don't actually want to smell outside what's around you because it's worse than a locker room. But the trigeminal stimulation gives you that pleasure. And so, what we are now in the process of developing is actually a space samosa, which is essentially a carb wrapped with protein. But in order that chefs have that ability to cater to their own taste buds, one of the first two chefs that we worked with, one was Corey Lee, who's a 3-star Michelin chef in San Francisco. Another one was Sachin Chopra, who's also from the Bay Area. He's a Michelin star chef. And the idea was to have various different dipping sauces. And so then the sauces would enable you to have curated flavor, but not to just limit it to sriracha because that messes up your gut microbiome. So when we're looking at flavor, it's taking into consideration not too much salt because then it impacts your vision, not too much sriracha because it messes up your gut microbiome, but having that balanced approach and yet giving astronauts the ability to cook while ensuring it doesn't take too much of their time because astronaut time is more valuable than gold. So it is something that we're very aware of. And I think it's that importance of camaraderie, team building, And sometimes it's boring in space. So cooking enables you to have a bit of creativity in your engagements.
Absolutely.
And
And Sunny Williams also, I mean, I don't know what her food supply is nowadays, but she did say she was bringing up samosas too, yeah?
I didn't know that. I'm going to have to ask her about it when she's down. A funny quick story, one of our astronauts, Greg Shamatov, when he was just selected to go to space, his father-in-law was a professor at Harvard. And so his father-in-law proudly said, "Oh, my son is going to space." And another professor at Harvard said, "Oh, my daughter is going to space." So it turns out that Greg and Sunny were both selected. And so they were both boasting, the fathers and father-in-laws. So it's a small world. But Greg brought up the first bagels to space. So I think food has historically been well loved by astronauts.
the things too that's a challenge is when you're going, let's say we're going to Mars. So you have the trip there, you have whatever time we spend on planet, and then you have the trip back. So carrying all that stuff with you is tricky. Number one, it's heavy, and having all those spices, we need to be able to create things in situ. So, how are you arranging for that to actually grow those spices? Is that part of the plan?
Shahreen?
So one thing
yeah.
that we were part of NASA Deep Space Food Challenge Phase 1, and what we had established was a microgravity sous vide. So the idea behind it was we partnered with Aleph Farms, and Aleph Farms actually cultivates steak. So for us, it was important that you know how to cook. And so the idea was you are able to grow herbs and spices on station. And so while you have the steak that is going to be created in space, you put it into a pouch where astronauts have the chance to pick out their own herbs. And so we would then have a flavor parcel that you put inside. And while you seal it, again, you immerse it in water. So instead of the way it's currently done, where you inject water into the pouch, you mush it around and has no texture and it's baby food, it would then be submerged in water and cooked. And so the great thing with the sous vide is it could sit there for a very, very long time and maintain a stable temperature. So that way no bacteria grows on it. But it's also a sophisticated method of cooking because the texture and flavors are still going to be intact. So that was sort of the avenue we were going, and that enables you to grow and cook with it. One of the problems with, for example, growing lettuce, I don't know how many of you experience this, but I'll have great aspirations and go do grocery shopping, and I don't have time. And then the lettuce will just become really, unpalatable in my fridge because it requires preparation to enjoy it.
Exactly. And it used to go bad a lot quicker before NASA created, discovered that gas that makes it rot. And now we have different food handling that helps that. So that was done up in the International Space Station. All right. Are there any other questions?
I remember in the early days at Burning Man, because I was part of the early team that put Burning Man together, when we were out in the desert, I found this company that caters to truckers. And they had these things called heater meals, which I think are still available. And it was some kind of prepackaged food. And all you had to do was like open the top up, and there was some kind of magnesium packet or something in there that created the cooking mechanism so that within a few minutes, the whole thing was cooked. There was no like water infusion. There was no sous vide. There was none of that. So I am just suggesting that you see if Heater Meals is still around and look at what they did, because it gave us hot meals out there
Tracy,
in the desert.
we're based in Mountain View. I haven't heard of them, but I'd love to get together with you and learn more.
Okay.
And Tracy, I'm getting ready for Burning Man. I'm leaving tomorrow. So after 20 years of doing this, it's actually a key part of my book, because living in an extreme environment, Burning Man's good practice.
Yes, definitely. I was there when there was like 30 people out there in the desert.
Wow.
So
I'm not gonna go that far back. But
I
yeah.
started the fashion show. Long story, not related to this. But anyway, thank you so much. I'm happy to meet or talk with anybody offline. Take care.
Well, and I have heard of that. Is a lot of times they'll take it on camping where they kind of like snap it, and then there's like a heating thing. But I think that what may be the problem there is weight. All this, we have to keep it light, and we have to keep it something that it doesn't cost a lot to transport, because if every meal had that extra little bit, then it would add up over time. I remember reading about one study where they eliminated 9 pounds off of a lunch, and it was equal to about $100,000 worth of fuel, and they were all celebrating about it. So every little bit of weight counts.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that would also be a waste issue where, yeah, after you break that apart, how do you reuse those, whatever, is burning inside? That's how the Deep Space Food Challenge, I was trying to solve for everything circular. Like even for Interstellar, like all the roots and everything, or all the waste from planting everything, it actually goes to these black soldier flies, which eat them up. And then from there, actually, they talked that you could actually eat black soldier flies as well. Apparently, they're crispy, but I've not tried it myself.
Well, and that's another thing too, is bugs are very important to our ecology, to this whole chain of events that happen in our body that we're unaware of. And we don't like bugs, but bugs are extremely important in this situation. So, all right. Are there any other questions? Just go ahead and chime up.
It reminds me of an episode For All Mankind. I don't know if any of you saw it, but in that first season, one of the astronauts is paranoid because there are ants everywhere, and it gives him PTSD even when he comes down on Earth. So bugs theoretically are great unless they have a great escape.
Yes. Yeah, we do not want them crawling on us.
Actually, the Planetary Society just put out a podcast about doing a cricket experiment in what's it called? Zero G. So it was a university student activity from Canada.
And bugs are lightweight and they grow.
A lot.
They can propagate, and they propagate themselves, but you still
Highly
have to feed them.
nutritious.
Yes, you still have to clean up after them. There's a lot of bug poop that we got to deal with, and so there's all these things that when you sit down for a meal that we've got to think about when we're doing it in space. Like you said, the waste.
The biomass of bugs might be valuable in space. When we are very accustomed to the more appealing food options here on Earth, we have a lot of options. When we are on Mars or elsewhere, we may not have that option. Bugs may be an option, processed, but for other things as well. I think you mentioned algae earlier, and I was going to mention this when I do my presentation. When we're producing things like, we may be eating algae, but if we're producing alcohol, it may not be based on the standard feedstocks that we use here on Earth, because it might be what we have available. And algae might be an option. It might be bugs. It might be something else, whereas we create whole new variations of alcohol or other foods based on what we have available in that location, which would not necessarily be what we have available here. Plus, when you add in the variations in atmospheric pressure and gravity and everything else, so it should be really interesting. And how the whole food and beverage culture will develop based on these entirely different circumstances, and maybe bugs will become, a primary food choice.
Well, talking about ants before, and you talked about beverages, in Australia, there's an indigenous company that is selling green ant gin. So maybe that would be a beverage of choice in space one day.
Well, and we do have a question. It says, what about foods that need pollinators? Which are a really good question, because apparently bees do not do well in space. So is there any way to do this mechanically or manually, or is this a different part of the conversation than what we have tonight?
I would not have the answer tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit in my book, but I'll wait till my presentation.
All right, so sounds good. So let's move on, and I'm going to introduce Chris Carberry, which he is the author of Alcohol in Space, which is a book that it really shows both sides of, the pros and cons of alcohol. I believe it's a very balanced publication. And he has also worked with a director to have a documentary that is on alcohol in space as well. He has also been on my podcast, so there I will put the link in to the show notes when we have the recording. So, Chris, take it away.
Well, thank you, Izzy. Thanks for having on. This is a great topic. It's one of my favorite topics, not necessarily the alcohol part, meaning that's self-serving. I mean, the whole food and nutrition aspect of space exploration. And yes, the book, which you can find on Amazon, is being has been turned into a documentary. And so anybody in New York on October 11th, the official premiere will be at the Explorers Club in New York City. So I hope to see you all there. I'm also the CEO of the nonprofit Explore Mars, who does a lot of work in food and nutrition as well. But this is a really important topic because, of course, when you look at the NASA future, and it's great when they're looking at, potential space stations and Mars exploration, but they usually leave out all these human elements. It's kind of a sterile vision of the future, whereas we're talking about truly bringing humanity, bringing human culture into space, and that is food and beverages and things that make life worthwhile and allow people to interact with each other, to build camaraderie, and to relax. And that's really, really important. And, my book, Alcohol in Space, as you mentioned, and discusses pros and cons, as well as a lot of the exciting things going on. But one of the things I start off with, or at least within the real part of it, I talk about science fiction as well, but is the fact that we've been drinking in space for decades. It hasn't been a problem. It hasn't been acknowledged by all the space agencies, but there's been drinking in space for a long time. And currently, often when there's a new crew up on ISS, they'll come together, have a little reception, have a shot of cognac, which is the preferred beverage in space, and just, to build that camaraderie between these crew members from different countries, from different cultures, and frankly, from cultures and countries that aren't necessarily getting along with each other on the ground. So it plays an interesting role, as it has throughout human history. And so that's not going to stop when we go into space. And of course, as we've mentioned, it's already happening, and as commercial space continues, it's going to become more and more prevalent. So it's something that we need to do, to look at, to study. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is part of the whole science behind it, even though we know that alcohol does not kill people in space. I mean, it will if you drink too much of it, I suppose, like it does here on Earth. We don't have any real studies on how humans metabolize alcohol in space, because the moment you do a real study is the moment you acknowledge is actually drinking in space. So there's so much science we need to understand here, we need to do over the next few years, as more and more real people go up in space, and we actually have people really living and working in space. And so one of the most exciting factors in this is that I've noticed when I was writing the book, is all the non-traditional people entering this arena because of their excitement about producing their beverage in space, or being able to see if they can use the space environment to benefit their product here on Earth, or being the first beer manufacturer on Mars. And so there are a lot of companies that have actually entered this arena, like Maison Mumm, the champagne company, who's been testing out their microgravity champagne and glass on the European version of the Vomit Comet, and they will be setting up their bottle up on with Axiom on one of their upcoming flights. Ardbeg sent up the first whiskey aging experiment. I think earlier somebody mentioned Vostok beer, which is a collaboration between Sabre Astronautics and Four Pines Breweries, or Three Pines Brewery, whatever number of pines.
4 Pines.
Or some number of multiple Pines Brewery, as well as like Ninkasi Brewery in Eugene, Oregon, who sent up beer yeast and created ground control beer, which was sold. But there are a lot of different companies that are trying to figure out how they can play a role in this environment. But it's like, for instance, a great example is not my favorite beer brand, but Anheuser-Busch did 4 experiments with barley. And while that's a great thing if beer lovers or whiskey lovers, maybe in the future of space, but that's actually, what's more important is this is a non-traditional company investing in critical technology for sustainability in space. That's an agriculture experiment. So that goes well beyond whether you want an alcoholic beverage in space. That is critical to sustainability in space. And so I think it's a wonderful thing when these companies are looking at this, trying to solve problems, or even one of our one of our participants here, Samuel, who will talk about this, when he's been developing, he has a prettier version of his glass here, his microgravity cocktail glass. Well, this goes well beyond drinking alcoholic beverages in space. You can drink other beverages, but it's also just the physics of fluids in space, understanding this, which have far more benefits than just having, a nice convivial time drinking your cocktail in space. So it's a wonderful time when these non-traditional companies can invest in these innovations that have far broader reach than just, whether you're going to have an alcoholic beverage in space. And they're also looking at the questions that, we've talked about already in this call. Two major issues. Of course, we talked a lot about, the fluid shift problem of when you don't really taste very well, why people like spicy foods. But also before this conversation went live for all the audience, we were talking a little bit about the problem with carbonation in space as well. When you're drinking a carbonated beverage on Earth, as you all know, when you look at the glass, the gases rise to the top and disperse into the atmosphere. When you're in space, or at least in microgravity, the gas goes to the center and creates a ball and starts expanding like that, and does that in your stomach as well. So astronauts reported wet burps and stomach cramps when they've had, drank Pepsi and Coca-Cola in space. And so that's not, so beer and champagne producers have been very concerned about this and have been trying to find the right balance of carbonation. And so Bostock Beer in Australia selected a stout with a low level of carbonation. And most of the people, when I'm giving this talk in Britain, they all say it sounds like a British beer. So it's like perhaps British stout is the best beer to drink in space. It remains to be seen. But once again, these are interesting questions that are really critical beyond the alcohol factor when we're actually having a lot of people eating and drinking in space, trying to figure these things out so that they really enjoy themselves. They enjoy their food, they enjoy their beverages, and they're able to interact. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I think I already mentioned, but the alternate food stocks and as well that we might use for these things. But let me just say, just shifting over to Explore Mars, my day job. We're also doing a lot of work on this, and we're starting a number of working groups. And actually, a number of people on this call I was going to reach out to soon, because we're starting up amongst several innovation working groups. We're starting a food and nutrition working group, probably between 10 and 12 people, basically to look at the challenges, opportunities, and see what is not being done, what really needs to be focused on by NASA and industry. I know there's a lot of wonderful work done. Shahreen's doing wonderful work. I know, Stephanie, you are. There are a number of other companies that are doing great work in this area, but obviously not everything is being done that needs to be done. So we'll be working on these working groups, but the food and nutrition one is one I've been wanting to do for many years. And so we'll hopefully have some results from that working group, hopefully within the next year, once we get it together and bring that group together. But I might as well stop it right now. But on another cultural issue in space, just before I end, I also have another book out if you're interested, The Music of Space, which just came out earlier this year, which looks at the history and impact of music and space-related film and television. But the last chapter is music in real space. And I spoke to lots of astronauts and other people that have performed or sent music into space, etc. Sorry for the divergent there, away from food, but music's important as well. So,
well, it's living in space. That's the part.
It's
It's not just existing in space. It's living in space. And one of the questions that I have is recently I heard about there was the analog mission that NASA did where they had astronauts in a facility for about 6 months, and they came out and nutrition was lacking in a lot of what they experienced. So do you want to touch a little bit on, does anybody on the panel know what study I'm talking about?
Is that Chapia? Oh, Shahreen.
Yeah, it is, I believe. And I think one thing that Vicky Flores had let us know, former head of NASA Food Lab, they focused a great deal on gut microbiome, which is our next focus. And what goes in must come out. So gut microbiome is very, very important in space, and pooping in space is not a beautiful business. So when it comes to our nutrition, which I'll talk about when it's my turn, we do now focus a great deal on how to balance gut microbiome because sriracha sauce, as was mentioned, does mess up your gut microbiome. And so it's very, very important. And when it comes to nutrition, it is a combination of people wanting to eat what they're given, and also if they eat too much of what they're not supposed to eat, the result of it. And yeah, it is the Shapia, I believe, that you're referencing. I'm really happy to know that NASA is now focusing heavily on food because it's not just recommending, but also what will give them pleasure.
Okay, a related story to that, actually up on ISS, or maybe not shuttle. No, it was on ISS, and I think John Grunsfeld mentioned to me once that, the astronauts they've stopped doing this, but for a while, I can't even remember what the snacks were, but they were snacks that really tasted good, but they were devoid of any nutritional value. And of course, the astronauts would immediately gravitate towards that and not eat as much of the nutritious foods. And I think that could be part of the problem as well. If, as you mentioned, if you have a lot of options of food, taste really good, but have no nutritional value whatsoever, that is a problem long term.
Well, it's one that we're dealing with in society right now. So
Yeah, and I think part of it from that was also the food fatigue. They didn't have as much of a selection of what they really wanted to eat, so they just chose not to eat instead. I mean, that's
a problem.
Yeah, that is a major problem. And going back to Shahreen's point about microbiome, it reminded me of a story with the Korean astronaut Yi So-young. She, in Korean, they of course have to bring up kimchi. But kimchi, they have to irradiate this. So you're getting rid of all the good stuff that comes along with kimchi in space. And we do need to solve for that gut microbiome issue.
Absolutely. One of the points I'd like to also bring up with Chris is that it's more than just drinking in space. It's more than just a celebration, type of thing in space. Alcohol is also used in medicine.
I try to be good and turn it off when I'm not talking and forget. But no, yeah, it is. And it's used in medicine. It's used for a lot of different things. And this is another area where these innovations have many other values for space exploration than just whether you're going to have an alcoholic beverage at some point. And that's, once again, when I mentioned before, that was one of the best parts, the most interesting parts of writing the book was, yeah, obviously I enjoyed the alcohol part, but all these other elements that came into play that were required to be able to create the alcohol you are solving and enable people to consume it, you're solving a lot of other problems. And I have a whole chapter on agriculture because, of course, if we're living off world on Mars or somewhere else, you're not going to have any alcohol unless you have a robust agricultural system, because you need enough agriculture that you can feed yourself. You're not going to use all of your agricultural growth to make alcohol. If you do, you're going to die pretty quickly. If in The Martian, if he had actually used all his potatoes to make vodka, he may have had a few happy moments, but he would have died well before he was able to escape Mars. So all these things are interconnected, and the more of these players that come in will be able to solve more problems by looking at the problems from different directions.
Any thoughts about algae gin?
I do talk about algae alcohol in the book, and I mentioned a number of companies who produced, forgot the different varieties, but I think probably gin's one of them. But there were a number of different algae-based alcohol products that were on the market.
I love gin personally, and I'm horrified by the concept of algae gin.
Well, and one of the things that Phnam is looking at is taking the algae and making it a base, not necessarily taking a big old spoonful of algae and that's what we live off of, but using it as a base for creating things that are 3D printed and that look like steak or look like vegetables or look like gin.
Yeah,
So that
I talk about
actually are
bioreactors in my
base.
book and how you can generate foods through cells, just pure plant cells or animal cells. And you can just basically, if you want a hamburger, you just grow it just from the meat cells itself. And then you just inject it with a food printer, and then there's your burger, cook it up. And now you have a Star Trek replicator. Boom.
That's what Shahreen was mentioning with Aleph Farms. They created the first
Exactly.
cell-grown steak, and there are a number of other bunch of companies like Finless Food in the San Francisco Bay Area. It produces, as you can imagine, fish products. Finless Foods. There was a great one, chicken one. One of my favorite videos from the chicken company who does it. The company was sitting down for a chicken barbecue lunch. And as they were eating, the chicken they were eating walked by because they just borrowed a couple cells. Yeah. So
I got
Okay.
a chance to try some food at Val Foods, and their claim to fame was doing the mammoth meatball. I did not try the meatball. No one did. It's in a museum. But they did do a quail parfait, which they now have it sold in Singapore at restaurants, which is pretty cool.
So how does sriracha mess with your gut?
So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term Delhi belly. For people who go to India or parts of Asia that they're not used to, their digestive system doesn't necessarily process heat the same way. So when you introduce a tremendous amount of spices, it doesn't digest in, I would say, the most pleasurable way. So sriracha has an imbalance in a lot of spice. This is also the case for a lot of spicy foods that are in the Southeast Asian diet. And if you have too much of it, it actually will result in you having an unpleasant bowel movement. And that's why it's really important to have balanced meals. And this is with anything where if you take it out of moderation, i.e., in space, because they can't smell, there's a tendency to put too much salt in your food. During COVID, that's also what happened, because when you put so much salt in it, it kind of lets you taste something if you can't smell it. And so just as too much salt, it turns out, impacted the vision of astronauts, the same way too much spice that is continually consumed will have an impact on your digestion. So it's just the complex way that your body actually, takes food in, digests it. And if there isn't a good balance, then that will throw it off. It's also why fermented food, as you were talking about, Stephanie, is really, really important. And the South Korean diet has quite a lot of fermented food. And that's a way to adjust your gut microbiome. Kombucha is the same thing. When you ferment it, it actually is a component that is more beneficial to you.
Sam also has been a podcast guest of mine, and he is an author and just released his latest books. So, Sam, will you please take it away and introduce us?
Okay. Hi, Samuel Coniglio here, longtime space activist, finally getting my book out the door after 30 years of writing variations of it and all that stuff. Okay, cool. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Cool. All right. So just very simple, 7 slides, nothing fancy here about food and drink in space. My book covers many different topics besides food and drink. There just happens to be one chapter on food and drink, so I'm going to focus on that for today. But at the very high level, I talk about these major issues. How do we make the life off-world living enjoyable, sustainable, and benefit humanity. So everything we're talking about here not only will help make life easier for living in space, but also maybe improve life on Earth in many different ways. One of the big topics, analogies I use is something called homesteading in space, where we got to really think about, well, just like living on a farm in the middle of the Great Plains of the United States, you have to find some way to survive out there. You got to, drill a well, you have to build a house, you have to build a farm, get some livestock going and start planting plants and farm. And so there's been a lot of experiments over the year to figure out how to do the same thing in space. How do you develop a full cycle farming system off world that can manage waste resources such as gray water, black water, and things like that, and grow food? And that's a big challenge for us. And one of the biggest challenges is this. I call it blob management. Without gravity, water sticks to everything. There's a lot of really cool videos on YouTube. You can take a look at this. But the challenge is that fluids act differently off world. We have to learn how to manage it, how to get liquids from point A to point B, how to avoid messes, and then do the fundamentals: dishwashing, laundry, farming, humidity control, preventing mold formation, wastewater management, so on and so forth. We need to learn how water works and how we can manage it to do these special things. In the topic of food and drink, I get into the history of the space food stick. It was one of the first experimental nutrient foods they were trying to put inside the spacesuit when you're actually, so you can eat while you're in the spacesuit. Didn't work very well, but became a popular thing for a while. And then, of course, Astreas, another experiment for creating high density, energy, nutritious food that you can eat in space. Really, blood and fluids redistribute up to the head, causing stuffy noses, reduce the taste buds. So food tastes different. We have to reinvent flavors for food off-world. And this is just a quick summary of all the design concepts I discuss in my book. I talk about a full-on kitchen galley situation. Right now on the International Space Station, they have a multi-purpose area that they turn into a galley to eat food communally, and that's fine. But for long-term living, if we're talking about years in space, we have to really think about design, how to design a kitchen in space for both manual and maybe robotic food preparation and cleanup and stuff like that. I talk about refrigerators, ovens, grills, water maker, coffee maker, robotic food prep, food bots and drink bots. In my book, I talk about some of the experiments I made. I created a couple drink making, cocktail making robots for entertainment, for fun. It was kind of interesting. Food design. How do we adapt the food that we love on Earth for space and also make it more tasty and palatable and also, enjoyable? The biggest challenge, as we just talked about, people are just like choosing not to eat food at all because they hate the taste of it. We need crunchiness. We need crunchy. We need texture. We need flavor to make it enjoyable. How can we build that in food off-world? Other stuff. At the end of the eating process, you got to clean the dishes. One of the big problems we have for any type of eating and drinking in space is there's a lot of one-use plastic packages that are being used out there and just burned up in the atmosphere. Can we create more recyclable stuff? Can we have dishes we can use over and over again? We need to find better, more efficient ways for reusing those utensils and those dishes and plates and drinking things and all that. I talk about dishwashers, actual machines that does the dishes for you, or doing it by hand. Always have a backup, because if the robot stops working, you got to do it by hand. So it's always have to have manual backup. Waste management. What do you do with the waste? Just like we were just talking about pee and poo and the outside products for the humans, there's going to be food bits. And how do we compost it? Can we create a wastewater garden to put the compost into to help fertilize plant growth and eventually grow more food for you and me? And that's really it. And this is my book, Creature Comforts in Space. That's my website, retrofuturist.com. There's a lot more to talk about, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm keeping it super short, super brief. Food is a very big issue, and I'm so excited after all these years, because I've been talking about this stuff for so many years, that now people are taking this seriously. We cannot go to Mars. We cannot go to the moon without serious research on the fundamentals of living in space. Let's just work on a couple private space stations where we can experiment and improve on all the basic lifestyle things that we talk about today and more, so we can enjoy just being in orbit, get that taken care of first, and then maybe consider going to the moon as the next stepping stone. And Mars, give it another century or so. I don't know. It's just long ways off. You've got to get the fundamentals of living worked out. And that's my TED Talk for today. Thank you.
Well, and one of the things I'd like to kind of open up with that conversation is the fact that space tourism, you know, when we first started going across the oceans, it was the rich queens and kings that sent the ships out, and those people had to survive in order to get to other land. When we started doing planes, it was the rich, it was the jet set, they even had a name for it, that paved the way to now everybody can travel the world without even thinking about it. Well, a good portion of the world. It's not something you've got to take a loan out and put your house for mortgage in order to go. And so space tourism is one of those things where we're going to go for the enjoyment of it. And I know that a lot of people can't wrap their head around doing that, but that is pretty much what we need to do in order to really make this thing work, is we need to have enjoyment off planet. So
Yeah,
do you want to open up that a little bit?
I should mention that I have encountered 3 taboos in the space arena. Maybe there's more, but and Chris can agree with me on several of them. There's 3 taboos in the space, and NASA will not talk about them. They're verboten, and yet it holds us back from progress. We need to talk about alcohol, we need to talk about sex, and we need to talk about space tourism. Those 3 areas.
Sex is the most challenging.
Yes, those 3 topics are verboten. We cannot talk about them at NASA. I have been like shunned from a number of events because I bring up these topics, and people are like, no, 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 we can't talk about this. You know, it has to be science and engineering. Well, it's like, well, if you can live out there for a long time, things happen. And, you know, you have to talk about these issues. And the hilarious thing was space tourism was like, that's a gateway to new industries. Yes, a bunch of rich guys and gals are going to go first. That's what happened with aviation. That's what happened with trains. That's what happened with sailing and cruise ships, the Titanic, whatever. I mean, you have that issue at the beginning, fine. But guess what? The folks who provide the services for those rich people eventually improve the technology to make it safer and better for more people to go, to improve their business.
Well, and Samuel, yeah, those taboos are a concern. I mean, I understand it. I mean, but, you know, when I was writing the Alcohol in Space book, at the beginning of the process, I was able to speak to a lot of friends at NASA and with no problem. But then word got down through the bureaucracy at NASA that I was doing it, and everything shut down. It's like the moment they heard, the public affairs folks heard, nobody could talk to me. Even if I was talking to somebody wanted to talk to somebody about synthetic biology. They couldn't even talk to me about synthetic biology because it was going to be in an alcohol related book. But you know who's purchased the most books? NASA employees. I have sold an awful lot of books to people who work at NASA. So
yeah, I designed this thing called a zero gravity cocktail glass. I was doing it was partially for fun and partially maybe I could make some money doing it. And there was a company called Made in Space. The CEO just loved my glass, and I gave him a couple so he can use for presentations and displays. And he talked to NASA, and they were actually going through the process of possibly flying or 3D printing, because they had a brand new 3D printer up there to 3D print a cup, a basic cup for drinking in space. And once NASA got wind about what it was, PAO said no. So, oh well, I can't fly myself in space.
And the problem with this, as you mentioned, is that this is not actually, I understand kind of the prohibition and their hesitation to talk about it in the earlier days when it's just professional astronauts. But now, even though it has happened, well, we don't know about that second one you were mentioning, but you know, the first one has happened, and space tourism is happening now, and you know, all of these things will happen. We need to understand it. The alcohol one is easy because we know people have consumed it, you know, and people will in commercial space. So we should do studies commercially at least. But you know, sex in space, that's really challenging, but they have to acknowledge it because it's not, I mean, there's going to be an accident. You know, admittedly, there's much more ethical, legal, problematic things. You can't just experiment with humans and see how it turns out. But what do you do?
I mean, these are the same people that brought us NASA TV to make it boring. So,
Like C-SPAN, right?
yeah. I mean, yeah, being that I used to work at NASA, I could see, all those things for taxpayer dollars. It's a little hard to justify. But, that's where commercial space comes in, and they could have as much exploration on all those three topics as they'd like.
Exactly, exactly. It's always been a perception issue, and we're finally getting over the hump of resistance from the various groups, powers that be. Like, okay, maybe. I mean, once you start waving dollar signs at people, suddenly they change their mind. It's like, oh, okay, maybe we should allow tourists fly up into space.
I understand that the inspiration for astronauts were originally going to do a champagne toast or some sort of toast, and they decided not to, not because of NASA, but because, of course, the flight was there to support St. Jude's Research Hospital, and since it was supporting children, they thought maybe it wasn't the appropriate time to have a, drink an, alcoholic beverage. But, it was definitely on their mind, so that's going to come up, I'm sure, very soon. So.
And Sam, you want to show us your 3D printed goblet and kind of tell us how it works and why it works?
Okay, so this is the zero gravity cocktail glass. Around the 2013, 2015 timeframe, I was trying to make a company out of it called Cosmic Lifestyle Corporation. And I was trying to find a way to market this concept. And I actually we won a couple design awards. I cannot take full credit because there were several other people who were involved with this project. And living in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's some beautiful collaborations between engineers and artists to create beautiful things, including these cocktail making robots, which I did for entertainment purposes. It was a lot of fun. San Francisco back in the day was awesome. And so we had these other crazy ideas, and astronaut Donald Pettit designed the world's first zero gravity coffee cup a few years ago. And that's what blew my mind. It was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so I was inspired by him to take it to the next level. His coffee cup design was basically a V-shape teardrop design. So you have the round top here and you have a V shape at the bottom. And if you look at the way surface tension and capillary action works, liquids like to stick at those channels. So the coffee cup he made, the liquids always tend to stick right where the V is, not at the larger end. It was just kind of ignored there. So it's just understanding the meniscus and how it flowed there. And I got to meet one of the scientists who worked with Donald to help develop it and actually got a patent for it. Learned quite a bit about fluid flow management, where you don't need pumps all the time. I mean, it's good to have peristaltic pumps, for example. They're very useful for pushing liquids precisely where you want it. But having the ability to drink from an open container in a weightless environment is new and unheard of, because normally in the space station in microgravity, they have a squeeze bag, like a Capri Sun squeeze bag with a straw, and they have to put like a cap or a pincher on the straw itself, because the liquid tends to want to ooze out of the straw just naturally by itself. So is there a way to design a drinking glass with an open lid so you can possibly enjoy the aroma and have it float and just take advantage of the features of blobs? I call it blob management, blobs in space. So it just sits there and it floats and you just suck on it to consume the liquid and enjoy the flavor. And of course, I designed it so that you can, drop this on the drink making machine, because I got to have a drink bot, robots drink cocktails, inject it, fluid goes in, fills up just enough, not too high. And the liquid stays in the grooves, and then you suck it to enjoy it. That was the concept.
Speaking of blob management, it's similar. That's similar to what Maison Mum did. Now they had a much less complicated design than yours, but there's just a little wine glass, whereas when they had the special bottle which poured the champagne into the blobs, which then the blob would go into the glass, which they could sip from the glass, which they wanted to do because they wanted to enhance the conviviality of drinking in space. That's very much they want their champagne to be the champagne of choice on private space stations, and that's really part of their business brand, to enhance conviviality, and they certainly want that to happen in space as well.
Yeah, I've seen their videos. It's really neat concept. My only concern, of course, is with the carbonation. It seems like it's a big pressurized vessel, and they have this round disc on top of it, which in theory should manage the release, but basically, you have a small rocket there in Potentia, so you got to be very
Yeah,
careful
they've had some
releasing that.
problems. They've had some bottle issues, and so their launch has actually been delayed a couple times. And I don't know what the exact issues are, but it may well be exactly what you're worried about.
Content's under pressure. Yeah.
It's just not just a glass of wine. It's just not a meal. There's all kinds of things that surround it.
Yeah,
So,
you have to redesign the glass. You have to redesign the containers for the liquids. You have to redesign just about all the utensils and, well, not all the utensils, but redesign the containers for any type of a liquid situation so you can get it from point A to point B to manage it. Because if you just have a round bottle, the stuff's just going to stick there. You can't shake it out. You have to either use a straw or do some other method to get that liquid out of the bottle. So reinventing bottles and containers of fluids of all kinds, that's stuff that we have to research more and find ways, especially for drinking and eating, how do we make it more enjoyable?
How would you design
absolutely.
it for, because this is for microgravity, how would you design it for lunar gravity or Mars gravity, where there is gravity, but it's at a lower level?
Then it's not as big of an issue because now you have something pushing it down. I mean, you might make this a little bit larger or something like that to manage the different sizes for the different gravity levels. But once there's any semblance of gravity, it becomes less of an issue. It's the pure microgravity part that's the challenge.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so it is time for dessert. Shahreen Reza is going to provide our dessert for the evening. So take it away, Shahreen.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to have this opportunity. When we first started this company, we're the first commercial space food company that specializes in astronaut nutrition and performance. People didn't know what we were talking about. And they're like, do you mean astronaut ice cream? But in truth, the freeze-dried, powdered astronaut ice cream that is so prolific in museums never went to space. It was just a gimmick. And so we moor ourselves in authenticity. And the aim was we must first not just go to space, but make sure our product is also consumed in space. So I am very delighted to say that our product is now up on the ISS and it is being consumed in space. And we have a phenomenal team. My chief operating officer is Scott Parazynski, who is himself a NASA astronaut. He's an Olympic coach, and he is also an emergency trauma doctor. And so for us, it is very much looking at that 360, not just food that's pleasurable, but also human performance, as well as what that does to your health, your well-being, and your body. And we are tremendously privileged because we have, I would say, the brain trust of those who are really pioneers in this world. This would include Vicky Clores, former head of NASA Food Lab, and also there is such a person who is a human performance coach, and his job is to train NASA astronauts to thrive in space, and that's Corey Twine. So I mention this because when we first started the company, we wanted to understand how you can make food more pleasurable in space. And so, Izzy, when you talked about the first people who traveled, even before it was the rich, it was the pioneers who were really trekking the way. And not only was food awful, a lot of people would have scurvy because they didn't have the right nutrients. And so in the famous Matt Damon movie, in the book, he talks about how he has more than enough multivitamins, so he can just grow potatoes. But in truth, degradation also impacts nutrients. So that was the first thing we focused on. How is it that you can ensure a product has all of the key micronutrients that astronauts are lacking? And vitamin D was one of the core nutrients. And then COVID hit. And we realized that all of us on Earth also happen to have key micronutrient deficiencies. Vitamin D ranks right up there. In fact, pediatricians also recommend vitamin D. So we looked at all of the different food sort of offerings, and chocolates were demanded in space across all generations. And space is the one place where it doesn't matter what your race, religion, ethnicity, geographic boundaries are, you come together. So one of my favorite stories was by an astronaut, Greg Box Johnson. He was up there with a Russian fighter pilot. And so on Earth, their job was to shoot each other down. In space, it's to survive together. And so Greg took up M&Ms, and the Russian loved the M&Ms. So they would kind of fight over it. He would hide the M&Ms. But before he came down to Earth, he actually gifted the M&Ms to his fellow cosmonaut. And so we started with Astreas, which is a high performance chocolate truffle, and it has within it your key micronutrients, everything from vitamin D, B6, B12, folate. But in addition to that, we've incorporated nootropics and adaptogens. So this means we really look at mental clarity, focus, awareness, so that you not just have the physical endurance to push through extreme pressure, you're very, very alert. And this is something that impacts a lot of astronauts because they have long days, your sleep is disrupted. And as we created it, we really paid a lot of attention to the ingredients we use. So there's a lot of talk of algae. And Izzy, you mentioned this, but there's a wonderful history of algae. In fact, it was in space that they realized the byproduct of algae can actually create DHA and ARA, which are the same fatty acids in breast milk that lead to brain development. And that's now prolific in all baby formula. And so we used algae oil as the fat base that we put in our truffles. And some of you have tasted Astreas truffles. So that's our flagship product. And we are now going to be launching on Earth this fall because the idea was that we aim it to those who are at their highest performance. They thrive when we bring it down. And so we had some phenomenal pilot studies. This happened both with analog astronauts and also surgeons, where we had surgeons on Earth for 1 month study take Astreas placebo and then their baseline. We realized that with Astreas, they had the ability to perform better. They had sharp focus and acuity. We also received a lot of feedback in sort of asks and formulation tweaks. And then just recently, we completed a study with NCAA athletes because an astronaut is as fit as an Olympian and as sharp as a surgeon. And one thing that I found quite interesting, one of the former NCAA athletes was a mother. She had a toddler, and then she had a 5-month-old and she was breastfeeding. And so we had different variations of Astreas. And the one that she really thrived in was the Astreas that had all the nutritional components as well as energy, which is a touch of caffeine, L-theanine, acetylcholine. And that's because she was breastfeeding. And so she needed the nutrition. So the next step that we're now evolving in, we're based in Silicon Valley. I previously worked at Palantir Technologies. It was one of the pioneer companies in AI and big data. Before that was the big thing. So we're now creating a machine learning platform to really personalize nutrition. And it's AI driven. And the idea behind it is we understand that each individual has their own unique needs. And the good thing with astronauts is you have the ability to understand their profile, their needs. So for example, one of the feedback is, what about something for skin? Astronaut skin dries out. And this impacts us on Earth. Beauty from within is really important. So things like biotin, collagen, vitamin C, it's good for your skin, your hair. And what we're now going to be focusing on is not just the food that is necessary, but understanding the individual needs of performance nutrition. And so we're using the AI-driven platform. And at the beginning, we start taking in data on what your profile is. A mother has a very different profile than someone who, needs to focus on longevity or is not as sharp. My father has early onset dementia. So his needs are very, very different from a student at Harvard. And we had that great privilege because Greg Shamathov's daughter, who, by the way, tested Astreas for 3 years of her life, is now a student at Harvard. So we kind of joke and say, oh, well, Astreas does serve its purpose. So that's the next stage in the work we're doing. But one thing we really care about, and Izzy, you touched about this, is different flavor profiles are also a reference to your culture, where you grew up. And now in 2024, especially the Western palate is open to international flavors. And so when we talk about curcumin, which is also a medicinal property that is used in a lot of Eastern food, it's haldi, it's the turmeric that, put into coffee, which we're actually shocked by because we never use curcumin in our coffee. But now we have the joy of introducing Eastern foods. So whether that's South Korean food, which is now warmly accepted, or Indian food, I'm from Bangladesh, that allows us to create flavor profiles that give more depth to the experience of eating. So I'm a Francophile. I love the French. I have a great, tremendous respect for the French Space Agency. But French food is very nuanced. And for that, you have to taste the delicate balances of food. And when you're in space, you don't have that ability. Therefore, if you have more pungent odors, whether it's cinnamon, wasabi, spice, it enables you to experience it at a greater level. So at Astreas, what we believe is you pair pleasure with performance. And that way you take joy in eating, but it also augments your performance. And that functional food is about what your needs are. Do you need to be more focused? Do you need more energy? Do you care about your sleep, your gut microbiome, your skin? And so that is really where Astreas is focused, not just how you augment human performance, but how you can have joie de vivre in that experience.
And no guilt.
No,
you're able to eat chocolate without guilt.
Not just you're able to, you are encouraged because it's actually good for you.
You know, this is very interesting stuff. And a lot of the things that you're looking at solving, like I said earlier, are real societal problems right now. Nutrition is, people are more, I think, they don't have the nutrition that we even had 30 years ago. That is a big, big problem in just society as it is. So in space, it's only more going to be more compounded. But I love the idea of chocolate being the salvation. Go ahead. Anybody have some questions? Go ahead, Chris.
You mentioned you were up on ISS, your product, and that's great. Congratulations. Can you explain what's happening? Is it just for pleasure, or are you doing actual experiments for the nutritional value?
Yeah, so we have an arm that focuses especially on experiments. So IIAS is our partner. So two of our key team members, Shauna Pandaya and Aaron Persad, they work with IIAS. And so for that, we've actually sent some of our products up for research with the parabolic flights. And just recently, we had the great pleasure of Kelly Girardi, also who worked with Virgin Galactic, take up one of our products. So we do have one arm that is pure research, and setting it up to the ISS for us, it was important that they try the product and they enjoy it. And so it's a combination of research that we're now doing on Earth, product formulation, and then setting it up and actually having it eaten. And so the machine learning platform, which is the next element I mentioned, we would then have the ability to take in all wearable data. So everything that you're tracking, when you track your sleep, so we can take in, information from Garmin, your Apple Health, your Oura Ring. So we use chest straps and Garmin watches. And that way, it's not just your profile and who you are, but also what your sleep rhythm is, your heartbeat, when you're exercising, what that rate is. So that's sort of the future of where we're going. And the hope is, especially with the growth of commercial space, this becomes something that is not just a necessity, but a desire.
And a quick question about growing cacao. We're looking at several years in space. What are the challenges with growing those plants themselves? I know like coffee trees, they take like 50 years before they have beans, but I have no idea about the cacao plant. Is that something that is being researched at all?
Yeah. One thing I'll quickly answer, Brennan just asked a question about how high seas. We actually had an opportunity to do one of our first pilots at high seas, which, if those of you aren't aware of, is when analog astronauts actually go to Hawaii, and it kind of simulates the environment of Mars. And that's where we learned not just the importance of micronutrients, but also adding nootropics and adaptogens because they want the clarity and focus. Now, Izzy, when you mentioned cacao, I do want to draw attention to the fact that on Earth, there's a tremendous situation with child labor that is associated with cacao, which is grown in places like Ghana and the Ivory Coast. So for us, we're really aware of the full supply chain. It is a very arduous process to actually extract from the cacao beans. So in truth, I think the production of cacao and making it from beans to chocolate is not something that will, at least within our lifetime, be available on space. But Sam, I agree with a lot of what you say, but one thing I hope does not happen, I hope that the Mars mission doesn't go so far out. I aspire for that to be something that at least our children can be there for, and maybe when we're in our old age, if we should live that long.
Thank you.
So,
we should still aim for the 2030s.
Yes, I want that to happen. So Izzy, while I don't think that we're going to be able to grow cacao and produce chocolates in space, the aim is, for example, I was talking about space samosas, but essentially a dumpling of some sort, where you have a carb that surrounds protein. And for that, Sam, as you explained it, to be able to generate food and then introduce, grown herbs and spices. And so almost to have a partial sense of growing and cooking, but then they also, you have to take certain things from Earth. And sometimes there will just be shipping. So the mission to Mars, it'll probably be that you have to send food way in advance for it to get there. And there are very complicated issues. But our hope is, first we look at the lunar colony, And when it comes to the history of colonization, it actually happened because of spices. It was the spice trade that the Portuguese and the British were in search of ways to make their food taste better. And for those of you who watch Dune, they call that precious resource spice. So we're thinking three ways. One, lunar colonization, deep space exploration, and then Mars. So I think along that path, it's critical that, yes, desserts, but also that active engagement of cooking in space and paying attention to your nutrition, what it does to your body, your mind, and your engagement with those around you.
Yeah, we can make it to Mars much faster if someone throws a lot of money at it, and we have a diversified space economy with a lot, public, private businesses, multiple space stations in orbit for multiple purposes. And between here and those destinations, I want to see gas stations. I want to see truck stops in orbit in the various locations between here and Mars, so that when you're along the way, you can make a pit stop, take a break, fuel up, and have a snack, and then go on your journey. You need to have infrastructure to make that stuff possible. We're long overdue. And Chris, you're saying something, but I can't hear you.
We can't wait for that to go, though. We need to go first and then build all that stuff that you meant, or there won't be any motivation to build that infrastructure. So it's like when we crossed the Atlantic for the first time, it wasn't in ships that were designed for the Atlantic. It was designed for, for the Mediterranean. And then when the need was there, that's when all the infrastructure came behind it. And so we need to do it. But that's separating a different conversation from what we're talking about here. So
exactly.
Yeah, and one thing Tracy just mentioned in the sidebar is if we find spices on asteroids, and again, just drawing my reference to For All Mankind, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but the last season is they try and harness an asteroid and use it as a way of fuel. So I think there are many new things that we'll discover in space exploration. But what I find deeply encouraging is now there's that curiosity and the belief that this can happen in our lifetime, which wasn't the case one generation ago. I mean, it's been 50 years since a human being stepped foot on the moon. And to me, that's mind-boggling. Why hasn't that happened? And in many ways, it's because this is the wave of the new space race. Commercial space is real. And I think that is what's catapulting us to the next frontier.
And
yeah, we've gone from 2 countries going to space to 80 was the last number I heard. So that completely changes the dynamic.
And Izzy, I know you focused on asking about growing, chocolate, like cacao in space, but why can't we just reinvent chocolate? I think what will have to happen with more chefs thinking about what ingredients are out there, what types of food we can recreate with the foods that can be growing into space. I know that sounds terrible, like, oh, we're going to get rid of, chocolate, but at the same time, what makes chocolate chocolate? Is it the taste? Is it the texture? And I think there are other ways to replicate that with the same nutritious outcomes. And I think that's going to be what will happen with a lot of foods.
And one thing you touched on, Stephanie, is even when we look at the history of immigration, butter chicken started in Glasgow, right? It was because there was some British man who walked into an Indian restaurant and he wasn't happy with the dried tikka and he's like, can I have some sauce in it? And then butter chicken exploded. So I think with the evolution of immigration into different terrains, I personally love Italian food, but I prefer my New York Italian pizza versus the authentic Italian in Italy because I'm biased. I have a North American, taste profile. So I do agree with you. Food is organically going to evolve, and a part of it is necessity, and the other part is your taste profile changes depending on where you've been exposed to the most.
And carob and cacao and all those are plants, that have phytonutrients. So we are going to learn a whole new batch of growing in plants and that will survive in space, and it'll completely change that culture.
And so don't forget, you still have the taste bud issue. You have the taste bud issue. You have to make the food strong or pungent or super powerful for it to be enjoyable in space.
And even as we're talking about different foods, I know Shahreen was talking about Italian food. We still didn't, and of course, a lot of South Asian food. We didn't even go into like indigenous culture foods as well, where maybe they have a lot of these unknown plants that are resilient and could actually be better in space that we have not discovered because we are so used to things that we could just find off of the supermarkets and like our Whole Foods. So there's a whole other world out there that we still have to explore, and probably lots of lost knowledge and hidden pockets of knowledge that we still have yet to explore on Earth that we can carry into space.
One other thing,
And back again.
yeah, and to be mindful, it's also when there are detrimental effects. I was in South America recently and I was in awe of what a beautiful culture it is. But cacao leaves were just a natural part of the native culture. And it was when Europeans went there and they processed it and they processed it and they created cocaine. Cocaine was never a part of the original culture. And that has resulted in drug cartels. And there's a huge issue now. So I think we also need to know that when we enter this new world, whatever we do will have an impact, whether it's environmental, whether, it's in the rocks and the minerals. And I'm aware of that because I'm from Bangladesh, where when UNICEF went in and they, drilled holes to create water wells, they didn't look at the geographic situation. And so they pulled arsenic into the water. And now there's a grand arsenic poisoning. So I think as we look at mining and sort of creating what we think is good, it's quite necessary to do a lot of research and respect the environment we're going into, because we have no idea what the outcome will be in generations beyond us.
Absolutely.
Going back to something Sam said, and something we all talked about, the food, the fluid shift, over having the strong foods. Actually, it may not be as big a problem as you think. What is the, in microgravity? Yes, that's the problem. Is that the same in Mars and lunar gravity? Or if we actually create artificial gravity? Probably not. Do we know how much amount of gravity is required to offset that syndrome? Yeah, because that's unique environment. You're in microgravity. But if you're in 1/6 gravity or 1/3 gravity, or if you're able to create artificial gravity and eventually, do you eliminate that?
I mean, just the research I've seen on airplane foods, I mean, you do, if you fly a lot and you're doing high altitude stuff a lot, you do lose a little bit of your taste buds due to the altitude, but not as dramatic as a full microgravity environment. And once you're dealing with gravity on the Mars and the moon, you may still want spicier food or more dramatic foods, but not as extreme as what you're dealing with in microgravity. I think it's really what's happening up here that changes everything. And of course, if you're in microgravity for long enough, your body transforms. You start becoming a space alien unless you find ways to compensate for these issues with gravity. Same thing with Mars and the moon. Your body will transform and adapt to the 1/3 G or the 1/6 G, and you're gonna have to grow food that goes with that. And it's kind of like a natural evolution. We can't avoid our whole body transforming to become a lunar person or a Mars person because you're there 24/7.
One of the fun side stories. So Scott Parazinski, our COO, he climbed Mount Everest, and so it's in Nepal, and he would eat dal. And dal is something that is in our culture, and I was quite surprised that that's what he would eat. But again, he became accustomed to it because that was what the Nepalese would be having. And so, like you said, Sam, you then grow accustomed to it and you enjoy certain things. But the opposite also happens. I remember Greg Shamatov said they loved sriracha sauce in space, and there was a certain kind of fajita, but when he had it on Earth, he didn't like it at all because the flavor profile was completely different. So in space, he craved it, just like they crave shrimp cocktail. And on planes back in the day, tomato cocktail was really, really popular. But when you have it on Earth, like on the ground, it doesn't taste as good.
Yeah, you go native. You eventually, you adapt, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Go, if you're going to that country, you enjoy that culture and their food and their lifestyle, experiment, learn how they live. And, you're doing the high altitudes, if the Nepalese are doing this with a doll, go for it. You're not going to bring steak and potatoes with you up to Mount Everest. I'm sorry. That's not going to work.
Okay, so when you travel into the United States from a different country, or you travel into Europe, or you travel into Asia, food has a morphing effect that it does. So people bring their culture with them and they adapt. Like you were saying, the New York version of pizza is very different from the Italian version of pizza. So it adapts to where you are.
And there'll be new types of foods that people will create, new types of recipes will be created when you're on the moon or on a space station or on Mars. You'll have different delicacies because it's regional, and you'll adapt. You create food based upon what's available at hand.
There'll be actually things that'll only be possible to be made on the moon or Mars because of the unique environment, different gravity, and different other environmental factors.
Mm-hmm.
And the soil, the regolith that we grow things in will change the flavor, I'm sure, too.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we are at the end of our talk, and I want to thank our speakers very much for spending their evening with us. It has been a fascinating conversation. Please do reach out to them. They have been phenomenal. And if you want to see the other interviews, Space Marketing Podcast, Chris and Sam have been on there. And I will be talking to Stephanie and Shahreen about being a guest on one of them. So with that, thank you all for being here, and have a good night.